So this is Kaiser Friedrich III of Germany. So often called the 99-day emperor, he came to the throne on the 9th of March 1888 as Germany's second emperor. However, he only ruled for 99 days, dying of throat cancer on the 15th of June 1888, leaving Germany to the rule of his troubled and emotionally unstable son Wilhelm II. And Wilhelm II's aggressive policies would end up massively contributing to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. So, could history have turned out differently had Friedrich III not died prematurely? Instead of dying at 56 from throat cancer, suppose he'd reigned for 10 or 15 years. He and his wife were keen liberal reformers. And so, had he gone on to rule for longer, the entire shape of German history could have turned out very differently. So let's explore this alternate vision, the obstacles Friedrich faced, and why his death proved to be so pivotal for world affairs. So let's explore some things that would have been different had he gone on to rule for longer. So the first is the liberal reforms that he wanted to create a more democratic Germany. So unlike his father Wilhelm I or his son Wilhelm II, Friedrich III harboured a more liberal constitutional outlook. Inspired by Britain's model of constitutional monarchy, Friedrich's progressive leanings intensified further with the influence of his politically engaged wife, Victoria, popularly known as Vicky. As the eldest daughter of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, obviously from Britain, Vicky grew up immersed in constitutional principles and reformist ideas, a background that her father Prince Albert hoped she would carry to Prussia when she married Friedrich in 1858. So Vicky was deeply instilled with Prince Albert's vision of parliamentary governance and liberal reform. And by marrying the handsome young Friedrich, at the time just the heir to the Prussian throne, she hoped to reshape Prussia and any future unified German nation along the Anglo-constitutional line. At the heart of Friedrich and Vicky's plans was the desire to expand the powers of the Reichstag, the parliament, and curtail the dominance of the conservative aristocracy and military elite. Ministers would have been made more accountable to an elected parliament rather than serving primarily at the emperor's whim. Press freedoms, freedom of assembly, broader civic participation would likely have been strengthened with limitations on censorship and an environment more open to public debate. In effect, Friedrich's Germany would have moved towards a more liberal constitutional monarchy. So the second is a reduced militarism and thereby potentially avoiding the First World War. So had Friedrich lived, Germany's foreign policy might have been far less confrontational. So one big difference could have been an Anglo-German friendship. Now, stronger alignment with Britain, shaped obviously by Vicky's ties and Friedrich's admiration for constitutional monarchy, could have prevented the intense naval arms race and hostility that later aligned Britain against Germany. With Friedrich at the helm, I think emphasizing diplomatic alliances instead of military build-ups, the direct path to the First World War, I think would have definitely been slowed, if not altogether averted. We're getting down the line here, but this is, and I guess, a little controversial, and we're maybe getting a bit too ahead of ourselves here, but no Hitler and no Nazi Germany. Had Friedrich gone on to reign for longer, and the First World War was in some way avoided, the consequences of not having a First World War would have been pretty enormous. So there would have been no punitive Treaty of Versailles, and without the crippling debts, the economic turmoil and the national humiliation, extremist movements like Nazism wouldn't really have gained traction. Also, a liberalized, stable Germany by reinforcing constitutional traditions and British-style governance early in the 20th century, Friedrich and Vicky's Germany might have remained insulated from radical ideologies like communism and fascism, so fundamentally changing Europe's future and potentially avoiding the Second World War as well. So it is important to stress that despite all of these possibilities, Friedrich and Vicky encountered significant opposition at every level of the German power structure. They were actually ostracized from the Prussian court. So Otto von Bismarck, the guy who basically unified Germany, he worked tirelessly to exclude Friedrich from meaningful decisions before he took the throne. And this meant that Friedrich and Vicky were sidelined, and by the time they came to the throne, they were pretty unprepared and they were sort of unable to push through meaningful reforms. And a big problem would have been the conservative Prussian elite. So the Junkers House or the Prussian aristocracy and high-ranking military officials regarded Friedrich as too soft and blamed Vicky's English upbringing for his liberalism. And many saw Vicky as an outsider bent on Anglicizing Germany. And so they were very, very suspicious of her. That is why they were largely ostracized at court and is why they didn't really have any influence. Also, another problem he would have faced is he would have had to have dismissed Bismarck and installed some kind of reformer. So if Friedrich had lived longer, he would likely have had to, yeah, as I say, dismiss Bismarck, but then finding that liberal reformist chancellor capable of resisting the entrenched conservative power base, that would have been a pretty hard task. I mean, ultimately, his son, Wilhelm II, would actually end up dismissing Bismarck anyway in 1890, but by then he was pretty old and power had gone to his head and even the military had turned against Bismarck by that point. But Wilhelm then replaced Bismarck with someone called Leo von Caprivi, and he was not a conservative, but he definitely wasn't a liberal either. I would say he was a moderate reformer, and he definitely did introduce some moderate reforms, but he was definitely no champion of parliamentary democracy. Also, Friedrich needed broad public support to be able to counter the Junkers and the military. Now, at that time, Germany was the fastest growing industrial nation in Europe, and obviously this was creating a new kind of like middle class of, industrialists, and this burgeoning middle class probably would have favored his constitutional push, but the existing power structures heavily favored the status quo. So Friedrich III's 99-day reign remains one of the greatest what-ifs in modern European history. Had Friedrich ruled a decade or more in good health, the course of German history, and by extension world history, might have been radically different because of his and Vicky's constitutional plans for Germany. A moderate reformist Germany could have alleviated Europe's tensions, avoided or curtailed the First World War, and prevented the political upheaval, which would, of course, end up abolishing the monarchy in 1918, and then the political and economic turmoil that then would give rise to Hitler. Instead, with Friedrich's premature death, Kaiser Wilhelm II seized the reins, pursuing militarism and risking global conflict, and then obviously that culminated in the First World War. I think, to be honest, in the best case scenario, Friedrich would have had a very, very difficult time liberalizing the Prussian-German court because the system was so stacked against him and Vicky. It would have been very, very gradual over a decade or so, with measured reforms such as, expanding the Reichstag's powers, tempering militarism, and improving civil liberties. But I do think it's likely that any liberal reforms that he and Vicky tried to bring forward would have been met with fierce resistance from, and to be honest, in all likelihood, watered down by the conservative Prussian establishment. The worst case scenario, I think Friedrich would have been undermined at every turn by the government, the Reichstag, the Prussian court, the civil service, and he probably would have ultimately been forced to abdicate in one way or another. I think, to be honest, in both of those scenarios, I really think that actually the First World War still would have happened, but just perhaps later or under different circumstances. But I do think a European war was probably inevitable, but I don't know, maybe that's just me being cynical. But what do you think? I'm interested to know what you think might have happened had Friedrich III gone on to reign for a decent amount of time, so do let me know in the comments below.